finals of the Intertext AP Debate Open 2025. Congratulations to both teams for making it this far and hoping to see what would hopefully be an excellent, wonderful debate. My name is Imran Ilmam. I have been granted the honor of chairing the finals for today. Before we get on to team introductions, happy to ask all the judges to introduce themselves in the order that is presented in the tab.
Hello, my name is Miro Fortuna. I'm one of the panelists for this year's grand finals of Intertext AP Debate Open. I congratulate everyone for making it this far and good luck.
Pranaya.
Hi everyone, I'm Pranaya. She, her, best of you.
Everyone, Utkarsh ne pronounce all the
Yugenesh, he, her, good luck for congrats for making it to the finals.
Cool. That's judges down. So I'm just gonna ask each team to introduce themselves, their speaking order, and their motion veto for the purposes of the ballot, starting with the Gov bench.
Hi, on Team Barney and Friends, we have Lauren Tay as first in reply. We have June Nam as second, and Advik Sharma as third.
Okay, cool. The veto?
Motion 2, and we prefer motion 1.
All right. For opposition?
Ellis speaking. Ellis speaking first in reply. I'm Tom speaking second. Arch speaking third. We vetoed the third motion prior to the second, so we're doing the first.
Cool. We are doing the first motion. Just gonna write down every single name just to be clear. Sorry, I forgot. I just want to confirm again. It's Lauren first,
Yes, and Lauren doing the
second, and Advik third, right? House rules before we start the debate. Firstly, of course, very much encouraged to try and offer and take as many points of information as humanely possible. Well, not humanely, but you get the deal. Engagement is overall good. We may decide close calls. Secondly, I won't be putting timestamps in the chat because honestly, I suck at putting timestamps in the chat. So I either hope one of the panelists can do that for, I don't know, everyone else. But of course, I expect all the teams to be putting themselves, which you should already have been doing anyways. And without any further ado, I hope nothing else I have to mention. Nope, shouldn't be. Debating on the first motion of this final, this House opposes the use of religious rhetoric in elections, calling upon the Honorable Prime Minister to open up this debate. Here.
Okay, give me 1 second to set everything up. So once again, my name is Lauren. My preferred pronouns are she/her. Okay, we're gonna do a little team cheer just to get up the mojo. Okay, hands in. Okay, Barney on 3. 1, 2, 3, Barney. Okay, and before we start off my speech, I really want to quickly do a couple of thank yous because it's a very rare occasion for us to reach the grand finals, and we really want to give a shout out to our coach Harish Natarajan, because he's coached us for quite a long time now, and he's obviously had a huge influence in how we debate today. Okay, without further ado then, I'm just setting up my timer. The choice is not a choice when you are told that you will burn in hell if you make the wrong choice. A few things in my speech. I'm first going to do setup before moving on to 2 argumentations. Firstly, on how voters are more likely to make irrational choices. Secondly, on how this actually worsens policy decisions. Before that, then, 2 points of setup. one, what does religious rhetoric look like? There's obviously a spectrum of what this rhetoric will look like, depending on whether you're in a developed or developing country. So it's probably, this debate probably is not operating in a theocracy. In a developed country, religious rhetoric probably looks like aligning with a church or, for example, a Christian majority. So, for example, campaigning on bully pulpits to specific church, visiting churches in those ways. It also probably looks like playing on your background. So if you are a Christian, then you play on your Christian background. It probably also looks like talking about more Christian policies. So, for example, when you're discussing issues like HIV, abortion, LGBTQ, and immigration, how do you explain these policies? Do you use religious rhetoric to explain your views on these policies? In developing countries, this probably looks like playing on religious divides. So, for example, in Nigeria, playing on the Christian and Muslim divides. In India, playing on the Hindu-Muslim divides. On our side of the house, we would prefer that religion is not brought up at all in politics. First argument then on why voters are more likely to make irrational choices. One, I quickly want to characterize how religious rhetoric actually goes into play with the majority of people. So obviously there is a spectrum of individuals from non-believers to very more religious believers. In this debate probably isn't going to be about non-believers because on either side of the house, whether politicians use religious rhetoric or not, you are probably not going to change your vote depending on that because religion is not a part of what you're deciding on. So in these cases, religious rhetoric is probably not electorally determinative. There's likely to be no change on either side. For those that are very religious, you probably also will not change on either side depending on how you vote. You probably already have very, very, very strong ideals and you will vote for the candidate in that regards. This debate then is about those who are in the middle, those who are not like totally hardcore Christians and those who are not like atheists. So it is probably about those who are a little bit less religious. I want to point out that even for these individuals, most of these people don't actually choose religion. A lot of them are born into a family that believes in religion, are raised to be like a Christian, and a lot of people around them just believe that God is real. A lot of the times, just in the same way that we know that the sky is blue, they believe that God is real and they believe in the existence of heaven and hell. It probably gives you hope to some extent. It probably is to some extent a part of your identity and social circle. Even if these people are not individuals who go to church every Sunday, are not individuals who pray before dinner or read the Bible every day, religion to them is probably still somewhat part of their identity, and it probably does still play a bigger role than other facets of their identity. What is the issue then? For these individuals, religious rhetoric then A, plays on their genuine belief. So it's your genuine belief that if you aren't voting for this candidate who is aligning with your religion, then you will probably like go to hell, or you are being a bad Christian, or you are like not being the best Christian can be, and you're not furthering your religion or playing to your ideals. Secondly, even if, for example, you may not totally believe in this and you may not like buy into the rhetoric that you will be making the bad choice and being a bad Christian if you don't vote for this specific candidate, there probably is significant amounts of pressure from the church and from those around you. So the fact that you go to church, or the fact that those around you believe in God and they are religious and they're voting for a specific candidate, you probably are now more inclined to vote for this candidate because of everyone around you. What are the actual implications of this? A few things under this. A, we think that this changes your voting patterns when you otherwise wouldn't have. This is obviously like illegitimate. We don't think that you should be shamed by your church, or you should like have the belief that you are going to be like a bad person, that you may have the possibility of burning in hell for all eternity if you are not like making sure that your country is going to be on the right path. We obviously concede that every single decision and every single election will have some aspect of coercion. But the point is, we want to get to the closest approximation of this ideal of reducing that coercion. We don't think it's fair to be exploited when you genuinely believe in a certain fact of life. And there's obviously going to be like a spectrum, but we still want to limit that to as much of an extent we can. We think that we can obviously see how this coercion exists when we look at the Bush election with the evangelical Christians. I also want to point out that this undermines the fundamental point of democracy when, instead of being able to rationally exert your vote to change like policy and whatnot, your rational choice is depleted from you. I'll take your point.
Things like believing in religion and feeling like you're going to burn in hell will occur regardless based on which politician you vote for. But also things like your church pressuring you will also still occur irrespective of whether or not the politician themselves use religious rhetoric. There is no delta.
There obviously is, because if you have a politician that is aligning with your church, that goes to visit your church, that says, I am a Christian, I don't believe in abortion because I am a Christian, you're far more likely to vote for him than if he never brings it up in the very first place. Second argument then on why this actually worsens policy decisions. I want to show you why this actually worsens the type of policy that is likely to occur during the election campaign and after the election campaign. First, During the election campaign, how does religious rhetoric actually play a role into this? I want to point out how powerful churches actually are. Even in places that may not be very religious, churches still often play a big role in the community around them. They do have a lot of support from their followers. They have a large number of followers, and they can guarantee turnout because they can meet every Sunday and tell their followers that it is their religious duty to, for example, turn out for election and vote in that way. In these instances, it is powerful for a politician to align with the church. It is also good for them that they're able to get religious votes because these individuals who vote based on religion, this is obviously their electorally determinative issue. You can diverge on other aspects like economics as long as you play on that aspect of religion. Why is this then an issue? We think that when you align with the church, you're far more likely to come up with policies that are maybe more conservative. This is because, for example, a lot of the times churches are more conservative than the regular societal norms. So this actually happens in the status quo. We saw this with the way that Bush tried to help HIV in Africa. The focus was on abstinence instead of things like education because he was aligned with the Christian church. We see this when the Philippines refuses, for example, condoms from pressure from the church. What is the actual issue with this? The policy often then turns right. So the spectrum shifts when one politician within a debate starts talking about more right-wing policies. Obviously, other politicians then have to cater to that. Other candidates have to cater to that. You also shift the Overton window. We see this with Trump when his policies become more and more extreme. The norm of what a good policy is actually then shifts. This also changes how you talk about the policy. You make less room for debate and less room for compromise. When you bring this up to be a religious ideal, this is when voters are less likely to be able to compromise on things like LGBTQ or things like immigration because having to compromise means giving up a core aspect of their identity. In a whole, then, the quality of candidates is likely to decrease. After you get elected, it is very likely that you will be forced to enact these policies in the same way that mayors who are elected with the Church of the Latter-day Saints in Utah have to align with these policies. On those grounds, we propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. To begin the opposition case, I invite the Leader of Opposition.
Just checking that I'm visible and properly audible.
You are for both.
Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Team government seems to exist in a world where, if someone does not explicitly say they are Christian, they are not going to make any policies that target the conservative Christian voters that team government brings up themselves, that churches are not going to specifically sponsor or endorse candidates where these issues are no longer on the forefront of people's minds. This is not true. People care about religion. It is one of the most influential factors in their lives. Of course, it is going to shape how they live, what they want, and as a result, how they vote. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, on why religious rhetoric is actively good in election cycles. And thirdly, on freedom of speech. I'll flag in my points when they're responsive. Firstly, on setup, just briefly going through again what this looks like. And we want to note, this is about elections, not policy after elections. So a policy like this would allow politicians to afterwards kind of bomb drop the policy they have as being religiously aligned, as being part of these things. But again, it's talking about scriptures, appealing to a religion, saying to specific people that you people should vote for me because I am religious and you are too. Okay, why then is religious rhetoric a good thing? In this point, I'll prove not only that this is not a negative, but on top of that, it's an active benefit to have in the cycle. The first thing I want to establish here is why religious rhetoric is not uniquely or mostly what is used to divide people in politics. I'll note that this is directly responsive to the majority of the first affirmative case, which relies on the premise that religion is primarily the thing used to divide people. So this is simply not exclusive to religious rhetoric. A couple examples of some other things people use to divide people are things like caste, class, race, gender, nationality, lineage, ethnicity. These are all factors that people play on. See Donald Trump. His slogan was not "Make God Great Again," it was "Make America Great Again." And I think we can say that he has unambiguously been one of the most divisive politicians in recent history. What you should take away from this is that the burden on side government is to prove that in the absence of religious rhetoric, there is going to be a meaningful change in how divisive politicians are. Because politicians, as they explain, have an incentive to be divisive, have an incentive to court votes of extreme voters. All of these incentives are symmetric, and they are something that will be reflected in the rhetoric in other ways. And the second thing I want to establish here is that you can dog whistle to religion without being explicitly religious. For example, a lot of religions are tied regionally. So you can talk about what region you're from or what region someone else is from to indicate something about them that you actually mean about their religion, that other people in your group, in your religion, will pick up on. This is simply something that you can do in a lot of covert ways if that is the appeal you are seeking. Their delta is extremely marginal. They have not proved to you to a sufficient extent why things will no longer be divisive if you take away one vector for division in society. Now, why is religious rhetoric actively good to have in these cycles? The first thing to say here is that you can just hide your rhetoric behind other messaging, which then is much harder to dispel and it's also harder to spot. Which is to say, it is easy to criticize a politician in America for being too Christian because the society is meant to be founded on secular values. But it is far harder to criticize them for being too American. That is something that is a lot harder to attack, but it's a lot harder to also spot as the product of their religious upbringing if you are not familiar with that religion. And I want to note here, the politicians have the same values. Politicians who are genuinely shaped by their religious upbringings, who are genuinely conservative, politicians who are genuinely anti-abortion or anti-LGBTQ because of their religious beliefs, will feel that way on either side and will push that policy to their constituents on either side. The issue is they are no longer being honest about why they feel that way. They are disguising it amongst messaging that is harder to combat, harder to actively dialogue with, and harder to take any action against. As a result of this, the average person is far more likely to be deceived by this, which is a practical harm because it means they're more likely to vote against their own interests. But secondly, lying is principally deceptive to voters. Your right to democracy, your right to any kind of representative in a government is based on your ability to know what policies they promote, to know what's actually going on. And at the point where it is obscured, it is hidden from you, you can no longer access that right meaningfully. But also, religion gives you a moral framework to weigh your politicians against and compare them to. So, if you have a politician who espouses incredibly Christian values, who then does something like, for example, cheat on his wife, you can actually call him out for that along the moral framework that he himself ascribes to. This is a lot easier to call people out for because it's something that the politician has already staked their reputation to and means it's likely to have a larger impact. So we probably get more accountability too. I'll take that POI.
Is it easier to call someone out for not adhering to American values, or is it easier to be like, oh, this is not in line with your religion?
I think it's easier to call someone out for saying something doesn't align with your religion because American values are nebulous. They are not set down. They are not written down everywhere. They can always be denied. Religion, in most cases, is in books, is in scriptures, is a lot easier to say is a factor to change on. Now, I want to talk about freedom of speech, which is to say, religion is a valid thing to vote on and something people have a right to discuss, especially in policy. Now, I have a couple reasons why religion is a meaningful consideration when it comes to choosing who you vote for. The first thing to say is that you are born and raised and often carry a religion throughout life. If I remember correctly, the only majoritively secular state is China. Most states have a population that is a majority religious. Secondly, you live your life according to your religion. Your principles are shaped by the way you are brought up, which is shaped by the religion you are brought up in. Thirdly, it dictates how you live, from love your neighbor to what you eat. If, for example, if you're a Jew, you can't eat pork. But fourthly, it also dictates how you spend your money. In some religions, interest is seen as bad and something that people actually can't do. Things like education and childcare are dictated by what your religion says is good or should be done, but even healthcare is something that you care about. Jehovah's Witnesses won't accept transfusions. These are all issues that people vote along, and allowing them to speak about this, allowing them to actively access discourse on the things they care about is incredibly meaningful for allowing them to access their civic rights to have a representative who cares about what they care about and will represent them in a way that they feel represented. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leader of Opposition. Moving on to the Deputy Prime Minister.
All right, give me 1 second just to organize my notes. Okay, I'll be taking POIs verbally, so feel free to just unmute and speak. I'm putting on my timer. Give me 1 second. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, when you are told you will burn in an everlasting hell if you don't vote along the ideals of the church, along the ideals of the mosque, you lose all agency and all defense in a political process. Proud to be on proposition. 3 things I'll be going over then in my speech. Firstly, on coercion. Secondly, on policy. And thirdly, on factionalism. Before that, I want to address the comparative that opposition tries to bring in this debate. She says that, oh, it's symmetric because there are other ways that people vote based on their identity, e.g. race or gender or nationality. We tell you the comparative here is ridiculous because the comparative between religion and your gender is not even close, in that religion goes beyond all worldly values that you have. Religion is so intrinsic to a person's identity that it cannot even be compared to something like nationality. I may feel patriotism for my country of Korea, but my identity as a Christian is far more meaningful because it lasts forever. It's not just the 80 years that I have left in this life, it's the everlasting hell that I will burn in if I don't follow the ideals of the church. That is to say that religion has such a high bearing on one's ideals and what someone believes that the value judgment that they make is purely made upon the basis of religion, while it may not be purely done on the basis of race or gender. For example, even when Obama ran in 2008 and 2012, even if Obama was black and said, "You're not black unless you vote for me," people voted for the other way as well. People voted for Republicans because they knew that there were some other judgments like politics, like policy, like economic defense, and like foreign defense that mattered more to them than their identity as a black man. However, if someone tells you you will burn in everlasting hell, we think the degree and severity cannot be understated. Opposition tries to make this a wash. It simply isn't. Firstly, then, on coercion, we told you a couple of things. We told you that religion influences, the religious rhetoric influences people in such a severe and great way, and this already came from Lauren's speech. We told you this is principally bad because elections are your only form of accountability against a state, which is effectively an armed gang as it stands. When you take away that last line of self-defense to check those in power and you conflate religion and the government, you lose all autonomy and all agency in any sort of political agency and any sort of political process. We told you on a practical, it takes such a large mental toll on an individual to make those conflicting decisions when they want to vote one way, but all their religious friends and all the community that they have within a religious sects are telling them to vote the other way. We told you that this is a massive harm. Owen tells you 2 things here. Owen tells you that firstly, it's symmetric because there are religious influences on either side on on their house anyways. We told you that first, this is a spectrum. We told you in first that very religious versus non-religious and non-religious people don't really matter in this debate. It's the individuals that are a little bit religious, and it's the people that are in the middle that are being affected the most because they don't have such a high yearning to religion that their ideals are already shaped and influenced by religious values in the first place, but those individuals are likely to be affected far more. Like if a politician comes to a church, presumably I'm already very religious. That's the example that they keep giving. But the people in the middle, like me, who identify as Christian, who now feel immense pressure, right? It's like a gun to your head. It's not really a choice when you have the illusion of choice, when you're being told you will burn for the rest of hell, when you're told you're never furthering the ideals of a religion that you were so deeply connected and so deeply part of. When you're told that is the comparative, individuals will almost always vote on the side of that part of their identity, which goes beyond all worldly values, all worldly possessions, all material possessions, and goes into something that is spiritual and something that is far greater than themselves. Owen then tells you you can talk about religion without doing it explicitly. We don't see the point here. First, it's incredibly difficult to spot because like you have to tie geography and somehow tie that to religious background and then vote on the politician on the basis of that. We don't think most individual voters are able to make that judgment. But secondly, we tell you that the comparative here is that the politician explicitly says, vote for me because I'm Christian. You will burn in hell unless you vote for these ideals specifically. The comparative to that is to that on proposition is, oh, I come from this area of the US. Please vote for me because I may or may not be Christian. We think the comparative in messaging, the frequency in messaging is so different that they can't even be compared. In a second, Owen then tells you, oh, individuals have a right to freedom of speech, and religion is a good ground to make your judgments off of. We told you that discourse is often not meaningful if discourse is limited and civil rights are limited by this freedom of speech and people's rights are taken away due to mass right extremism. We tell you then you don't have that right to freedom of speech, even if it's important to an individual, if you're making all your judgments of that and you kill all discourse, because note that the foundation of religion is that you do make policy and you continue and execute policy on the basis of religion. And that means no one can challenge you, because if someone says, oh, that's not the right thing to do, you can just say, oh, look at this religious scripture. It says it's the right thing to do, so it must be the right thing to do. It kills all semblance of discourse at all, panel, and that's exactly what we don't want in this debate. Secondly, on policy, then, we told you that religious rhetoric shifts campaign process. It shifts them right, and it overshadows all discourse. How does this change when they are actually elected? We told you there's no scrutiny because you can use that religious justification, and like in a Catholic-heavy country, for example, like Italy, you can use that to justify all decisions, because every moral code and every moral judgment is on the basis of the scripture and is on the basis of the religious text in the first place, that you have to align with those religions, values you purported, because the only accountability comes from religion, because that's your main voter base. We tell you that means that once they're in power, they have to follow along with everything that's said. Owen only gives you 1 point here, and she says that, oh, you can hide your rhetoric. We told you that this is good. If you can't talk about policies in a religious way, you have to talk about it and justify those policies. For example, you can't just justify abortion by saying, oh, the Bible says killing babies in the womb is bad. You have to actually justify why that's a moral thing to do, and that's not existent on proposition side. We told you if it's covert, you sway less religious people anyways, so you would like to vote more rationally. I'll take your point before I move on to my final point.
Do you think churches, which you describe as overwhelmingly coercive, will stop promoting candidates and pressuring their constituents to vote for those candidates if those candidates
okay, I got your point.
physically come to the church?
I get your point. I get your point. But the point we have told you over and over again is that it's not about individuals who are already devout and who are in churches. It's individuals like me who are Christian but don't feel that much of pressure because we don't feel that it's such a great part of my identity. It's the individuals in the middle that don't feel such a great part and aren't non-religious either. It's somewhere in the middle where they feel now an obligation to vote in terms of that because they never get that messaging, but now they get such a higher frequency of messaging and higher consistency of messaging as well. Thirdly, on factionalism, and the premise here is that countries in which multiple religions spout rhetoric will have factionalism on all levels. What type of factionalism exists? We told you two things: religion versus religious factionalism, like Nigeria, like the Christian South and the Muslim North, or the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority in India, or intra-religious conflict, for example, like Protestant and Catholic, or Sunni versus Shia. We told you that in terms of capability, there is such a difference. And where is this likely to occur? We told you primarily in developing countries where arbitrary borders were drawn by colonialism, and often different religious groups are in the same space, where religion as a whole and groups are likely to fend others off in order to get more religious power and in order to get more legitimacy in the political scene. Why is this factionalism likely to occur? In terms of incentive, elections are incredibly important for religious groups. It strongholds their power and gives them the authority that God has put me into this position of political power. You want to desecrate others, sects, and other religions because it feels like a zero-sum game. You want to take power from from other groups away in hopes that it increases your legitimacy. We told you on capability, you have massive levels of following, and elections become an important issue for policy, which means rhetoric is uniquely able to rile up a population. You have unique targeting, and the ability for media to influence thoughts becomes so large. And that influences factionalism on all levels. For all those reasons, so proud to be on opposition.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Moving on to the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Lovely. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The good thing about side opposition is we have 2 ways that you can win in this debate, whereas side government only has 1. Because we suggest to you that there's a very large principle that exists in this debate that's independent of side government's arguments that gets no response from side government. Because we tell you that there is an incredibly important thing called freedom of speech and freedom of religion that's really important for a variety of reasons, and it actually wins this debate regardless of whether you believe that side government achieves their delta or not, which we would suggest that they don't. This is for 2 reasons. The first of which is that religion is the most important thing in a majority of people's lives around the world. The vast majority of people are religious, and the vast majority of religions are the most central and proximate thing to all people's life. Like our first speaker gives you like 6 different ways that it intersects with you: economically, financially, domestically, every single way that it could possibly intersect with a human being. Religion does that. But second, unlike side government says, this debate actually does intersect people who aren't religious too, and does intersect those people and improve their lives. Because we would suggest that if we can improve transparency in the political sphere and say, rather than trying to beat around the bush and do things like dog whistling and do populism in other harmful ways, not going to take that POI, I think it's far better if you just explicitly say, I'm not going to vote for abortion, or you shouldn't vote for abortion because Christianity, rather than try and blaming it on something else, blame it on someone else. Because unlike side government says, the church is still going to push that abortion is bad in certain cases, regardless of whether you're allowed to talk about it as a politician. It's just far easier to connect with particular politicians in the vast majority of instances that aren't about abortion, that are about other things that are quite helpful, like financial values, like domestic values, like foreign policy, like environment, which obviously connect with you in a religious way in a vast majority of mechanisms. And that is something that's really important. Do not let that principle become a wash panel if it affects all people. So even if you don't believe it's actually as important as side government's principle, the problem in their case is they've narrowed their stakeholders down to such a small group, where we target a far larger group and a far more important group, i.e. all voters. We make impacts far more transparent, and that is something that you should care about. But let's engage and win in their world too, because we would argue that the second question that we should answer in this debate is whether side government achieves their delta. And we suggest they don't, because we suggest they must prove there is a meaningful shift in politics. But we suggest 4 claims at first. The first thing to suggest is that dog whistling exists, that you can hide things under other things. And like this is quite easy to do, way easier than side government is willing to concede. Notice how they give no mechanisms, how it's really hard to do. I'm going to give a really easy one. You can just say siding with Israel as opposed to siding with Judaism, and bing, you have an instant connection. Like, it's actually very easy to do in the absence of 0 mechanisms given as to why it's hard to do, and 1 mechanism given as to why it's easy to do. You should obviously favor that. But the second claim is that there is an incentive to be populist. You're going to be populist in other ways regardless. The third thing to claim is that the religious populism is the best way to do this because it is the most accessible, and it just gives a really strict morality framework. And that's very useful because that promotes accountability of politicians, a group of individuals who are not only incredibly important, but typically seen as very slimy individuals. So when you have religious frames of morality, it's really easy to suggest where they've stepped out of line, and really easy to point that out. And that's something that's really useful for a transparent comparative democracy. But the last thing that we would suggest is that we're not saying, not pointing out that you are voting or making policies along religious values is legit actively lying, and that's really harmful. We get 5 things in response. The first thing we suggest, the first thing is like the introduction of both speakers, which suggests that you're going to be massively coerced because you'll be told you're going to burn in hell if you you don't vote for me. A few problems with this. The first problem is most obvious answer is politicians are not pastors. They do not have the power to interpret scripture. They do not have the power to interpret religion. You obviously can't do this. But secondly, I would suggest that if you do something like this, and if you make hyper-religious claims and suggest that you're the one person you could vote for in your society, you are now under a massive microscope, because churches are enormous organizations with people whose entire lives and jobs are interpreting scripture, which means that if someone isn't in fact the one person that you should vote for if you're in that religion, you're going to be called out by people like pastors incredibly immediately, incredibly damningly. So these people are going to be called out immediately. And I would suggest that if they are in fact the right person to vote for under that religion, and they say that, and it's proven to be true by people who interpret the scripture, you have more transparency, and that makes people's voting much easier, and that is a good thing. So we flip that claim. The third thing I would suggest is that there is actually a direct incentive not to say something like this, because the vast majority of countries around the world have a multitude of religions, are incredibly multicultural, which is why someone like Trump doesn't say Jesus saved me, he says God saved me. There's a direct incentive to try and play to multiple religions. So it's incredibly rare that something like this is going to happen. You have a direct incentive not to do it. The third thing, the second thing that they try to say in response here is that churches are incredibly powerful and can do things like harm elections. Problem is, this exists on both sides. We're not limiting power of the church. We're just increasing transparency of politicians. Unclear that it makes a difference. But I would suggest this makes it much easier for churches to give recommendations of who the politicians are that you should vote along the lines of if you are a certain politician. That's a win for side opposition. The third thing I would suggest is that politicians are just showing up one-off to a church and just saying, hi, I'm part of this church now. People are going to be kind of pissed off and call that out and say that's really bad because you obviously are just playing it for the views, are doing it for something like that. However, on the flip side, if you are someone who's genuinely committed to the church, that is going to be something that's very obvious and people are going to be aware of it. It makes it much easier to vote along your religious lines. That's a good thing. The third thing they try to suggest is that they try to suggest that the church is incredibly conservative, and this is going to push conservatism into politics, and that's a bad thing. First claim, side government is standing for literal censorship in elections. That's pretty fucking conservative. Seems hypocritical. The second thing I would suggest is that churches are becoming more progressive over time as they do cater to modern audiences. As the church becomes modernized, there are more modern messages that are seeping through. The third thing I would suggest is this is just empirically false. Like, policy around the world is becoming more progressive, not conservative. You need to consult evidence to back up your claims. The fourth thing I would suggest is actually, I would flip this claim once again and suggest that if people want an increase in conservatism and they vote for people that increase in conservatism, that's good politics and that's really useful. Before moving on, I'll take that point.
Religion is the most important value judgment for the 45% of Christians in Nigeria. Should they be forced to live under Sharia law influenced by extremist religious rhetoric?
No, their opinions and beliefs are going to exist on either side. You just give them capacity to understand who they should vote for based on their religious beliefs far more easily under our side. The churches and Sharia law are going to still exist in Nigeria. Those values and ideas exist on either side. You never prove a meaningful delta, which is why you lose this debate 2 times over. 2 additional claims that they try to make floundering in the water. The first of which is that religion is incomparable to things like nationality and very hard to do, and therefore it is very hard to do things like dog whistling. Firstly, we're not just saying it's comparative, we're proving that it's very easy to be populist in very different ways that can interact with people differently, and you can just do things like Israel and Judaism, which I explained earlier. But the last thing that I would suggest, and the last thing that they try to do to claim to win this debate, is suggest that dog whistling does not occur and give no mechanisms to prove that when we literally prove it ourselves. It's obviously way hard, and they suggest things like, oh, it's way harder to spot under their side, and like that's kind of the point, right? We're trying to prove that it's way harder to spot, way harder to identify who you should and wanting to be voting for, and that's really useful. Clearly, at the end of the debate, side government do not feel that burden. They do not change the world in a meaningful way. But obviously, under our side, we protect a principle that is incredibly valuable. People should have freedom of religion and speech. Vote side opposition.
Thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, introducing the Government Whip.
Yippee-ki-yay. Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, cool. I'll start my first word. You got this, Advik.
Yes, how did
Oh
it?
my God. Okay. I want to be very clear at the start of this debate.
The debate is about neither extreme, as I think opposition understands. It's not about people who aren't religious at all and aren't going to vote on religion. It's not about, like, this doesn't influence people who are super religious and are always going to vote on religion. This is about the middle portion of people, the people who have religion in mind, who believe that the sky is blue, who believe that God exists, the people who have been raised and socialized around religion, believe it is a fact of life. It is about these people going and seeing on TV a politician saying that they are being Christian, the other side is like being sacrosanct to whatever religion they are supporting, right? This is about a politician saying, if you don't vote for me, then you are not a Christian, or like Christians should align with me. I am the Christian candidate. It looks like Narendra Modi saying, I am the candidate who will defend Hinduism. And if you don't support them, very implicitly is a connotation that if you don't support these candidates, you will suffer eternal doom. This is what the comparative in this debate is about. And I think the fact that the proposition doesn't understand this comparative loses them this debate. Three clash in this debate. First, on people making informed decisions. Second, on policy quality. And third, on factionalism. What did we hear from opposition in terms of informed decisions? We heard three things. The first one was that religion isn't actually coercive. The delta is marginal, they say. They had three mechanisms here. The first one was that religion is not uniquely divisive. You have other things like caste, class, race, gender, nationality. I want to note that this is true, but there are multiple different things here. So for example, your caste, your class, your race, your gender, your nationality. These are all individual variables which can come into conflict with one another. These are parts of your identity which you can control to some degree. These are things which multiple political parties can have say over. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party can both say that they are the party that supports women, can both say that they're the party that supports minorities. This is not exclusive to certain policies that are determined by religion. But also I want to note why religion is uniquely divisive. And the point here is, once again, as I mentioned earlier, and we've been mentioning throughout this speech, the threat of eternal damnation. It is the fact that you worry that if you do not vote in a certain way, you worry you will go to hell. Or even if you aren't that religious, it is about the fact that you want to be religious. You want to feel as if you are being a religious person. Because in your eyes, as someone who might be mildly religious, who grew up in a religious family, but maybe isn't always going to church and stuff, you probably have some feeling inside you where you're like, oh, I want to feel slightly more religious so I feel like a better person. For these people, religion becomes uniquely divisive. You take an issue that otherwise wouldn't have been very important, maybe it's still an issue amongst those other variables like caste, class, race, gender, and now you make it a wedge issue for these voters. Second, they're saying that dog whistling happens covertly. I'm happy for it to happen covertly. We were never saying that dog whistling will not, we obviously said it's unlikely to happen too much, but we never said that this was the worst thing in the world. Because when it's covert, the impacts of it are much less. Because the characterization we gave you in terms of how this affects people was very different. We told you that it's explicit political messaging which involves religion, which actually has these negative adverse impacts. On our side of the house, you don't have that negative messaging. And as a result of that, the dog whistling doesn't have the impacts which opposition is purporting them to have. Third, they note that churches still support candidates. Yes, they still support candidates. Once again, this only affects the people on like the very hard, extreme level of religion. This doesn't affect a lot of those middle people that this debate is about. Second, then, they tell you that religion good later. So I want to note the first thing they say here, which is the alternative on our side is hiding the rhetoric under something like, oh, I'm American, instead of I'm Christian. One, I would say that this is more contestable. That is to say that Donald Trump can say I'm American, but then Kamala Harris can be like, oh, that is not what it means to be American. This is very different to Donald Trump saying, oh, this is the Bible, and Kamala Harris being like, no, that's not the Bible. That's like a Roald Dahl book. These are two very different things. You can't just like. I think the thing is with religion, it's not very contestable. With these other things where you're being more covert, you allow for room for discussion to exist. Second, also again, I don't think that it's a bad thing to be more covert with these things, because when you are more when you are openly saying I am a Christian, I am going to do things because of my religious beliefs, what you're doing is you're shifting to the right. You're committing entirely to believing in a certain fundamental set of principles which align with your religion. As a result of this, what ends up happening is you shift entirely. For example, in 2016, Trump, he had to shift his voter base to the evangelical right. That means you neglect a lot of the centrist voters otherwise. And these people now get left out. And religion causes an overall shift to the right, as Lauren explained to you. Then they tell you lying is deceptive. Okay. Moving on. Then they tell you scrutiny is easier on their side of the house. And I want to note the example here that they give you. They said, if someone cheats on your wife, you can't come at them for being non-American, but you can come at them for not being Christian. Bill Clinton, you didn't come at him for being Christian very much, but also I don't think that scrutiny is necessarily that much easier with religion. I think religion gives you a lot of loopholes out of scrutiny. For example, if you believe that abortion is a fundamental issue for you, and you see someone who's like purporting that they're going to stop abortion, then they can do whatever the hell they want on the other side, and they can just make a bunch of really bad decisions, and no one is going to care. Their third claim then is on freedom of speech, and their claim here is religion is really important for people, so it should be discussed. I want to note firstly that the importance of separating church and state, and the point of this is very simple. The religion that people have should not come into contact with the politics of the state. For example, in Nigeria, as June told you in a POI, but we didn't really get a solid response to, was 45% of the country or something like that is Christian. 55% is Muslim. Those Muslims would prefer if the entire country was ruled by Sharia law. We don't think this is democratic. We still want to have some semblance of an independent state. Therefore, I think it's important for you to have that separation of church and state. Also, debate 101. Let's read the motion. It says this House opposes. It is a value judgment debate. Is religion good or bad when it comes to political conversation? Not is banning it morally acceptable or not. What did we tell you under this clash? We told you about how religious rhetoric affects people. This isn't about non-believers and hardcore conservatives that I told you. This is about people who broadly believe in a religion. And for those people, religion is a fact of life. We told you about how this affects these people, and it's a coercive decision for them. One, they change who they vote for. Other issues which wouldn't have been wedge issues, but which have just been one of the many variables in their decision-making calculus, now become wedge issues, and that's a coercive choice. We think that's very bad. It's illegitimate entirely. It's effectively like putting a gun to your head and saying, vote for me or you will die. But instead of dying, the alternative is far worse because that's like, vote for me or you will suffer from eternal damnation in hell. So, second clash then on policy quality. What did we hear from opposition here? We heard nothing here. My sheet is empty. Second, what did we tell you here? During the campaign trail, there's going to be a push right, as I told you, and discourse is not going to have many accountability mechanisms because you cannot have discourse when you're like mentioning religion. For example, as I said earlier, you can have discourse over what it means to be American. It's much harder to have discourse over what it means to be Christian. It's much harder to have discourse over it is fair or not to be LGBTQ in a Christian society. These are two very different things, and I think on our side, we allow for discourse a lot more. But secondly, there's less scrutiny on their side on policy once they're in office, so people get away with a lot of policies that are bad for the people just under the guise of religion. Third, if you don't believe any of these things, as June told you in his extension, given our what we told you about the developing world and clashes between different religions, there are a lot of terms to do with like genocides and long-term sentiments against other religions, which come as a result of infighting religion. We think that is a unique way to victory as well.
Thanks, Golfwhip. Moving on to Opwhip.
Can I be heard and seen?
Yep.
Side government doesn't understand how coercion works or how to prove it in a debate, in fact. There's three things that you must do in order to prove that there is significant amount of coercion to a point that is to the detriment of the very narrow stakeholder that they pointed out. They needed to show to you that firstly, you had to prove that religion was extremely influential to these people. Secondly, they had to prove that this influence was indeed negative in order to be coerced negatively. But thirdly, they had to prove, and this is huge and damning, they had to prove that this coercion was going to end the moment you start opposing or remove things like religious rhetoric within society. And that is three steps that that they needed to do, that they needed to prove in order to win this debate. And let's say how they did not meet the burden of proof for any of these steps. Firstly, on whether or not religion has an extreme influence on these people. The problem from first affirmative is that they picked this very weird stakeholder, because when we say, well, there's enough influence or there's not enough influence, it is unclear what the stakeholder actually look like. You can't claim that religion is extremely coercive, but then say that this debate isn't about people who care about religion a lot, who can be who don't go to church enough. Like, it's unclear how they're guilt tripped by the church if they're not attached to the church enough. It was never clear what this stakeholder actually looked like. But secondly, if this is someone in the middle who's like kind of believes in God and believes that the sky is blue, it is unclear why they don't have any sort of agency or any sort of rationality as to oppose religious rhetoric that is actually or say that, oh, I look at religious rhetoric and be like, well, now I'm going to flock towards this because I have absolutely no agency, even though I didn't like go to church growing up, even though I didn't do any of this. That stakeholder analysis is what should lose them this debate, because not only did they reduce the amount of impacts that they can get and reduce the delta to bare minimum, but it is contradictory in nature. They try to eat their cake and have it too. The stakeholder, and let me be charitable here for a second. Let me take them at their best. Let's assume there's enough influence of religion in order to be coerced, but like they're not like fully religious people. I don't understand what it is, but let's just assume that there is enough influence within this group of stakeholders that they talk about. Firstly, I would say that if there is enough influence of the church and religion in order for these people to be influenced by it, that the church and the religion that they follow can still influence them, whether or not there is rhetoric that is religious that exists. They can still do things like endorse politicians and say, well, this politician is anti-abortion and anti-gay. How about you follow this and you should do that? Their religious friends who are voting for this politician, they will feel guilt tripped by looking at people around them, basically. And so this still fucking exists. But secondly, they say that oh, well, religion, at some point they concede that religion is just influential. And if you believe that is influential enough to coerce people, I would say, who fucking cares? This is not an issue, because we agree with you and we explain to you that religion, in fact, is extremely influential to people. And the fact that it is so influential to people, given that things like how they manage their finances, given how they manage childcare and what education their children should get, how they perceive healthcare, how they perceive the environment. If it is so influential, we agree with you in the influence and say, well, you know what? This implements, this is how people look to their morals, this is how people inform their principles, let them vote along it. It is unclear why this is then a bad thing, given that it is something that people care about enough. You can't just be like, well, this person doesn't care about it when you want to, or cares about it when you want to. If this person does care about religion enough, then let them fucking vote on it. We then tell you that just because a politician can't visit your church, it is unclear why the politician will still not pander to this voting bloc. Like, it's unclear why, if you come from like conservative states, why you still wouldn't push conservative policy, like being anti-abortion or being anti-gay. It is unclear. You can still do that, as we explained to you, without actually having to be religious. We tell you that you do things like dog whistling, and the only response that they give us is that they don't care about dog whistling, and this is why they lose this debate, because they do not understand just how important it is for you to be transparent to your voters. This is the same, I would give the analogy of Donald Trump being like, well, no, I'm not a part of Project 2025. No, I'm not going to be bad. I'm not going to be associated with Project 2025. I don't know what it is. And then making the people of the most, who were the authors of Project 2025, the most conservative people, and appointing them in office. This is what it looks like. This looks like hiding your actual beliefs, not justifying them to the people, and then actually implementing it. This is why we need transparency within the political system. This is the reason why it is important. Dog whistling happens, you don't care about it, and they themselves say that it becomes more confusing. I would say that to the average person, being able to understand where your politician is coming from, where your representative comes from, what their actual ideals and beliefs are, is just the most important thing in this debate. Because you can always, by the way, dog whistle and say that being gay is immoral and unnatural. And that is such a bad thing because you can't debate that. You can't be like, why is it immoral? Why is it unnatural? However, what you can say is if you believe that being gay is bad because of religion, you can say, well, actually, there needs to be separation of church. You can have that form of discourse in our world. However, in their world, you just confuse a person. Yes, POI.
If someone is incredibly racist, would you say that it is a good thing to have direct racist political rhetoric in elections?
Yes, if someone is racist, I would rather have them stand up and be racist so that they don't confuse people to a point where people of color vote for this person against their own interests. This is the fucking point. If your politicians has beliefs that this team, by the way, but never proving why it's bad to be conservative, but this team shows that there's so much harm in being religious and so much harm being conservative. If you are that politician, I want you to tell me that. I want you to tell me that so that I can identify who you are and I can't vote against my interests. I can make that decision for myself. And that is something that is important and that is something that escapes them. They say being coward leads to more discussion. How? It's unclear why any of the points manifest in their world. Ask yourself at the end of this day, would Donald Trump be nationalist? Would Donald Trump pander to the populist narrative? Whether or not he has the ability to say the word God or Christian, the answer will be yes. That is why it is important for you to vote side neg. Remember that religious freedom is something that is extremely important. People should be allowed to vote on the lines of religion if they wanted to. People shouldn't be allowed to hide their religion and actually implement change without being transparent with their voters. So proud to negate.
Oh, thanks, opposition whip. Now moving on to opposition reply.
Again, just making sure I am audible and visible.
Yes to both.
Great. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Team government loses this debate when they make the mistake of thinking that religious rhetoric in elections is what meaningfully influences someone's religious views in the ways that they vote in line with their own religion. This is untrue and unproven. I'm going to do 3 things in this reply. Firstly, I'm going to discuss our principle. Secondly, I'm going to discuss policy. And thirdly, I'm going to discuss being deceptive and divisive. Firstly, then, on principle, we tell you that there is a right people have to freedom of speech and religion. People's lives are influenced by this. This has been recognized by most countries, even those that recognize church and state. This is in the American Constitution. This is one of the very few things outlined in the Australian Constitution. It's a prescient factor in people's minds that influences how they live their lives. This is something that people have a right to talk about, have a right to understand what their politicians think about, and have a right to vote along the lines of. What does side government say here? They say, well, in Nigeria, there's a 55% Muslim population who want everyone to live under Sharia law, and the 45% Christian population probably wouldn't like this. A couple reasons why this is an insufficient response. Firstly, it's unclear that if they don't say it, they won't still do it. They haven't proven that there's any link between a lack of rhetoric and then not establishing this rhetoric. That this is also probably something that the politicians would be making quite clear. You can be known to be Muslim, even if you do not say, I'm going to enact Sharia law. And Muslim voters who might want Sharia law are probably likely to vote in the same way here. You can hate a religion and want to do genocide as they bring up as a result of religious rhetoric without pushing religious rhetoric. Again, this can be linked to things like class, it can be linked to things like race, it can be linked to things like region, especially in developing countries where you have places that are primarily of one religion and primarily of a different religion within a country. You can achieve the same goals through dog whistling, which they concede happens and they concede lots of people would not be able to pick up on. But we tell you, if it's portrayed as secular, it's far easier to cause a religious minority to look immoral rather than just religiously different. Because if your views are the secular, normal, moral views, it is far easier to say that any dissident is just immoral in a practical level, as opposed to being a religious disparity. Secondly, then, on policy, the first claim by side government is that middle ground voters will feel pressured by religious rhetoric when their candidate comes to their church and then vote against their own interests. The issue with this assumes that they interact with the pressure in some way, because pressure is not a nebulous concept that haunts the brains of every religious person. You have to interact with it, be it your friends or your family or your church, and they concede that churches will still support people, and they concede that religious people will still have favorites, which means anyone who interacts with this pressure interacts with it symmetrically on both sides. They secondly say you have to shift right, but it's clear this is the only reason this would happen. It's unclear this is true. Note Martin Luther King, a pretty Christian guy who I think we'd all agree was not that conservative. It's clear that this is a harm. I do not think the OIV, who notably is not politically leaning, would automatically think conservatism is a harm in any debate. Thirdly, they say that you get more divisive policy, but it's clear this is true or exclusive, because things like nationalism, things like racism, are things that can lead to the same results. On being deceptive and divisive, they tell you should be able to explain your policy logically, but if you do not believe your policy for logical reasons, explaining it logically will never change the fact that you believe it that way. You will not be swayed by logical discourse in the alternative, which means you will continue promoting it outside of this. They say you can't have religious discourse, but I think the number of sects in every religion should tell you this isn't true. But it's also harder to have discourse if you're pretending to believe something for reasons that aren't true. We also tells you that this is the only way you can access your civic right of knowing who you're voting for and what their policy is. Lying is undemocratic, and it takes actively away from voters' capacity to make their own decisions. If you believe in having any kind of representative policy, you must vote for side opposition.
Cool. Thank the op reply for that speech. Let's now end off this debate with the gov reply.
Okay, give me 1 second. O3's logic is effectively that someone racist should say racist things directly, which is also hate speech, by the way. Their POI response just genuinely doesn't make sense. They want to say that it is good to be called out for being racist. It would be good to be called out for religious rhetoric. The problem, however, materializes when you are applauded and voted in for your racism or religion because a majority of the country is racist or religious. This is what we've been telling you about the harm of religious rhetoric. We don't want someone in to be voted in because of how racist they are. We don't want somebody to be voted in and applauded based on their religious extremism. This happens all over the world, in places like Nigeria and places like India. This is 70% of the world which is developing. First question then, on who is able to actually get rational voters and why this is important. And second question, and then I'll move on to the second question of who worsens policy. Firstly, on rational voters, we told you that most people are not atheists or very, very religious. They're often in the middle. And I think here's the issue with opposition, with proposition. Opposition. What they don't understand is that people can be in the middle. I am the stakeholder that they fail to understand. I sometimes go to church. I do watch the election news. What happens then is when I sometimes go to church and I watch election news and suddenly religion and they're playing on my identity becomes a really, really big part when I otherwise would have voted for economics, when I otherwise would have voted for things like that were important to me, like tariffs. I will now vote based on my religion because they're playing on my religion. For these people, playing on religion changes the electorally determinative issues that they otherwise would have played with because you play on their beliefs. So maybe it is true, the politician doesn't say that you will burn in hell if you don't vote for me, but you believe that you will be a bad Christian if you do not vote for the politician that says he is Christian. So it doesn't matter what the politician says. What matters is how you internalize it. Why is this not symmetric? I want to point out, because their only response to this is that the church will be powerful on both sides of the house. Churches only really affect the really frequent churchgoers. These are the extreme ends of people who will be coerced on either side. But there are also individuals who maybe only go to church like not that frequently, who do watch the news. And when they do watch the news and they do see this politician constantly talking about the religious background, I really fucking guess they're going to vote on their religious fucking background. And I also want to know that coercion exists for the middle ground of somewhat religious people anyways. We never had to prove coercive rhetoric will be eliminated entirely. That we are able to minimize it is good enough. And here is why dog whistling, we think, is still okay, and we're willing to bite that bullet if they want to talk about it. The point is, if you are unable to appeal directly to people's religion, you probably do have to do it more covertly, but this is probably good, because for the vast majority of people, like somewhat religious people who aren't fully religious, you are probably unable to sway their electorally determinative issues then, when they otherwise would have voted for economics, they continue to vote for economics. I also want to point out then that the reason why religion is different from things like being Black or like being a girl or being a minority or being gay is because there's a genuine belief that if you don't vote alongside your religious lines, then you will genuinely just go to hell or you will be a really bad Christian. Their point then becomes about a freedom of speech. I want to point out that this is an opposes motion. We are not banning like the freedom of speech. We're saying that if possible, we would like to mitigate it. And I want to point out that the reason why it is okay to mitigate it, even in the worst case, is because it does hurt people. Like we would probably say that it is bad for Obama to come up on a platform and say, you must vote for me because I am Black. And if you are a Black voter and you don't vote for me, you are a bad Black person. That probably isn't very okay. You would probably oppose that. That's what we're trying to do. We think to this extent then that it is okay to mitigate their freedom of speech, especially when in the developing world, you are far more likely to heighten tensions, which was June's entire extension. Second question then on who worsens the policy's impact. We told you that religious rhetoric means that you do have to align with the church, that when talking about policy, you do bring religion into it. It means you're far less likely to get compromised when you're talking about people's beliefs that if they don't buy into this, then they will actually go to hell. Their point then was about how like MLK is okay. Like, yeah, but this probably isn't the debate because he's not a politician. I also want to point out then that we're able to obviously get far more scrutiny because even if you are a religious politician, you can still get called out for your actions. On those grounds,